In this lecture, I'll be discussing structuralism and its influence within anthropology. Specifically, we'll start with the discussion of the key themes within structuralism. From there, I'll go into a discussion of the works of Lévi-Strauss, his influence within anthropology, who he was influenced by, and then also we'll talk about his works in particular, as well as some of the critiques of structuralism. He's also associated almost single-handedly with founding the school of structuralism, but other individuals also contributed along the way, most notably Edmund Leach and Sherry Ortner. So the themes within structuralism. First, it's an attempt to discover the fundamental principles by which humans will impose order by parsing down or breaking down the world into culturally meaningful bits. The concern is rather with what people think rather than what they do. So for the structuralists, it's not so much a matter of what people are actually thinking or what people are actually doing, but the underlying patterns of thought in all forms of human activity. And so there's this idea that humans are fundamentally equivalent with one another at our root, at our structure, our way of patterning thought. And that's what the structuralists were trying to get at overall. They were, and so they weren't necessarily interested in particulars. And so very contra to Boasian notions overall. We can see this in, I think, in a discussion by Lévi-Strauss in the 1966 article, which was one of the required readings for this week, where he discusses or situates structuralism in a larger context of the history of anthropology as a whole. Claude Lévi-Strauss was born in Brussels and he grew up in Paris. His father was a painter. He went to the Sorbonne in Paris, where he studied law as well as philosophy. From 1935 to 1939, he was part of a French cultural mission to Brazil and served as a visiting professor at the University of Sao Paulo. His first ethnographic work was conducting periodic research, and this was his first ethnographic work. He also conducted periodic research forays into the Mato Grosso and the Amazon rainforest, working with the Guayaturu and the Boro Indian tribes, then in the next year, other societies as well. He almost single-handedly founded the modern field of structuralism. In the 1940s, he proposed that the proper area of study for anthropologists is not how people categorize the world, but on the underlying patterns of thought within the world as a whole. This was in a paper in the 1940s. He spent half a century conducting cross-cultural studies of kinship, myths, and religion in an attempt to understand human cognition. His theory is based around psychology and looking at the underlying logical processes that structure all human thought and how these will operate within different cultural contexts. So cultural phenomena are not identical, but they are products of underlying universal thought. And his work essentially centers on how to uncover this type of work, this underlying structure as a whole. Lévi-Strauss's structuralism is used to reconstruct the conceptual systems of depopulated and fragmented cultures. It's systematic and almost predictive nature of many of his analyses. He looks at the historical relations of neighboring Plains tribes, Indians tribes, by ways in which their neighbors inverted each other's myths. Also ways in which ecological and geographic information is encoded. To establish the meaning of any figure within a myth or a mythic plot, one needs to consider the multiple variants of the myth. And we see this in the reading from the McGee and Worms text, where he talks about the drawing from Radin's work. He looks at the three different myths that are similar to one another, and then talks about the fourth in relation to that, which is seemingly an outlier. He looks at the idea of hot cultures versus cold societies. Hot cultures were change. These are change valuing societies, and how they work on essentially cold cultures or change denying societies. He is heavily influenced by both Mauss and Durkheim, by the French scholars of the previous generation. Again, Claude Lévi-Strauss is French himself. He draws from the underlying structures of kinship, the 1949 work, from Durkheim's the elementary forms of religious life as well in 1912. The Prague School of Structural Linguistics he's also influenced by these individuals, particularly Roman Jakobson and Nikolai Tobotsky, who placed emphasis on the synchronic or descriptive rather than the diachronic or historical study of language, and promoted the theory that linguistic meaning was built upon large contrasts between sounds or phonemes. He defined and characterized the phonemic study of languages, and this provided Lévi-Strauss with the concept of binary contrasts that was fundamental in his formulation of structuralism. Lévi-Strauss's structural analysis in 1945 outlines this theory of kinship based on Mauss's notion of reciprocity. Jacobson had the greatest influence on Lévi-Strauss of colleagues at the New School of Social Research in the 1940s. The emphasis was on the sounds or the phonemics, the basic unit of sound in a language that can be characterized by the physiology required for its production, the position of the tongue, lips, and so on. These theorists as a whole focused on how each language builds the system of phonemes of which it is composed, and discovered that such systems were built upon contrasts or binary oppositions rather than simple catalogs of sounds. Lévi-Strauss also draws from the work of Saussure's structural linguistics, looking at the distinction between lang and parole. His selected works of Lévi-Strauss are, talks quite a bit about kinship and the elementary structures of kinship in 1949, which re-examined how people organize their families by examining the logical structures that underlie those relationships as a whole. He's also interested in kinship based on alliance between two families that formed when women from one group married men from another group. And he uses gift-giving from Mauss to describe the functions of the incest taboo. And again, in The Gift, Mauss tried to demonstrate that exchange in primitive societies was not motivated by economic motives, but instead by rules of reciprocity, wherein Lévi-Strauss applies this to marriage in primitive societies, arguing that women are a commodity that can be exchanged. Lévi-Strauss contended that one of the first and fundamental distinctions of humans is this between the self and others. He refers to this as a natural binary distinction that then leads to the formation of the incest taboo. Lévi-Strauss's interest in mythology lies in his belief that studying mythologies of primitive peoples allows him to examine the unconscious universal patterning of thought. And in its uncontaminated form. So this idea that so-called primitive peoples are closer to the root of true human nature, that it's somehow uncontaminated or unpolluted. So Lévi-Strauss looks at the mythology of primitive peoples as closer than Western beliefs, because the training we receive in Western society buries the logical structure that Lévi-Strauss seeks to essentially unearth. Looking at through these layers of what he refers to as cultural interference created by our social environment. Lévi-Strauss expanded the notion that human cognition was structured into binary oppositions, and he proposed that the fundamental characteristic of human thought was essentially the desire to find a midpoint between such oppositions. The structuralist examined the rules that govern the relationship between mythic elements, and the task of structural analysis, again, is to break down the myth into its constituent elements and uncover the unconscious meaning found in the binary relationships between them. Uncovering this hidden structural core will reveal the essential elements of all human thought. And again, this is what Lévi-Strauss builds upon in each of his works, in The Savage Mind, in mythologies, The Way of Masks, as well as Myth and Meaning. Again, the importance of myth, studying mythology of primitive peoples to examine the unconscious universal patterning of thought in its uncontaminated form. Second, Western society will bury this logical structure by cultural interference created by the social environment, hence the focus on primitive peoples. Examine the rules that govern the relationship between these mythic elements. The critique of structuralism, it's the likelihood that the patterns discovered in the analysis are, to a great degree, found in the imagination of the interpreter. The choice of oppositions is subjective, as well as the interpretation of what the pattern of opposition actually means. And so here we get into discussions about emic and etic once again. It can be programmed into a computer to get the same result, but does this, putting the data into the computer itself make it scientific? No, of course, the computer is based on the assumptions of the programmer. And is it falsifiable? And so this is a fundamental question about science as a whole, is the idea that you are testing hypotheses, that you can actually test them, that they can be proven false. Rather than proven true. And if it's not falsifiable, it's not science. As a means for proving the binary structure of the mind, structuralism has failed. The reality that Lévi-Strauss proposes is an unconscious one, and thus it is not verifiable. The influences, nonetheless, of structuralism are rather broad, particularly symbolic anthropology, which was popular in the 1970s, the rise of cognitive anthropology, and postmodernism throughout the 1980s. And so we can still see hints and glimmers of Lévi-Strauss's work and influence overall within anthropology, particularly along these lines. Sir Edmund Ronald Leach was born in England. His father owned and was the manager of a sugar plantation in northern Argentina. He went to Marlborough and Carlow colleges in Cambridge, where he graduated with honors in the medical sciences in 1932, studying mathematics as well as engineering. In 1933, with a company in China, on the return, he took ethnographic notes and made drawings of the Yami and Boto Tobago. He met with Malinowski in 1937, and this resulted in what he referred to as a conversion experience. He was involved with the Burmese army. In 1946, he was a lecturer in social anthropology at the LSE, or London School of Economics. He got his PhD in cultural anthropology at the London School of Economics in 1947. In 1953, he became a professor of Cambridge University in social anthropology, where he became interested in structuralism after spending a year at Stanford, where he worked with Jacobson. He was provost of King's College, Cambridge from 1966 to 1979, a fellow of the British Academy from 1972, and knighted in 1975, the president of the Royal Anthropological Institute from 1971 to 1975, and a fellow of the British Academy from 1972, as I said, and knighted in 1975. So theoretically, Leach's theory, like Lévi-Strauss, Edmund Leach believed that myths contain binary opposites. He saw them as similar to digital computer systems, which run on binary programs, 0 and 1. Utilized the telephone and television metaphor in his analysis of myth as a form of communication. The concept of redundancy in communication theory is important. Communication engineers think of redundancy in terms of transmitting messages across distances. Lévi-Strauss thinks in terms of transmitting messages through time. In both cases, redundancy helps to ensure that the message is transmitted accurately. Structuralists accept the binary nature of human thought as a given. Leach calls it intrinsic to human thought without offering any evidence that it is in fact intrinsic to human thought. His works include Political Systems of Highland Burma, a study of Kachin social structure in 1954, which challenged the theories of social structure and cultural change, noting that there was a wide discrepancy between the details of the ethnography and what Lévi-Strauss, what was in the case of the Kachin Burmese people, used as a model for generalized exchange merit system, showing that Lévi-Strauss's the ethnography must be wrong. Rethinking Anthropology in 1961. The village in Ceylon, where he directed his attention to theories of kinship as ideal systems. Genesis as myth and other essays. The superficial content of the myth is irrelevant. It is the deep structure that and the analysis should pursue. The deductive reasoning with deep structural patterns must occur. This proceeds in his analysis to find what he believes must exist in his data overall. He also wrote a retrospective account or an account of Claude Lévi-Strauss, or a summary of him, and then there have been essential volumes that have been published by and about Edmund Leach as a whole. Sherry Ortner is one of the required readings from McGee and Worms. She's a feminist anthropologist. She looks at the sexual meanings and the cultural constructions of gender and sexuality, arguing and suggesting that gender stratification is based on the fundamental opposition between nature and culture.